Hello, my name is Dr. Elaine Hunter. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and also a senior research fellow based at UCL, and we've just completed a study into cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT, for depersonalisation derealisation disorder, or DDD as we call it for short. And today we're making a short film to tell you what we did and what we found.
So can you explain the background to this research?
Yeah, there's been very limited research onto depersonalisation derealisation disorder, which is very sad because it causes people a lot of distress and it can also cause a lot of impairment to functioning. So we've been very lucky to be funded by the National Institute for Health Research, which is actually a government body that gives money for funding into NHS research. And this particular funding stream that we've been funded through is called Research for Patient Benefit. And the reason that we were able to get this research funding is because we'd previously conducted 2 studies and published these studies, and that was looking at CBT for depersonalisation derealisation disorder, but in a specialist clinic. And the results from those studies showed that it really seemed to benefit people, that people got better, their symptoms got better, and they were better able to function. And so as a result of that, we've then been able to get this funding to see whether we could actually train people up within the NHS to deliver this. So we're going to get then more people that can actually deliver this within the NHS. Also, the reason that we've been funded is that in the previous studies, people were not compared to a group that hadn't received the treatment. So people had been referred to a specialist service and they'd been offered treatment, but we didn't have a comparison group. And in terms of research, what you always want to do is have what's called a randomised control trial, so that you get people that are offered a new intervention versus people that are not offered that intervention, so you can actually see whether the intervention itself is helpful and is working.
And how did you go about this?
So the research team at UCL worked with some local London NHS trusts to help them identify the people with depersonalisation derealisation disorder that were actually already in their services, so that we could then train up some of their clinicians. In the end, we trained up 36 clinicians in the different NHS trusts that took part, and then once we'd helped them identify those people that might be eligible, we then did an eligibility screening to see whether they met the criteria for the study. And those people, if they did meet the eligibility criteria and consented to take part, they were then randomised into whether they would receive the CBT for depersonalisation intervention or whether they would receive treatment as usual, as it's called. So that would be whatever they would normally get within their services, and then we would be following them up as we went through.
You mentioned that this was a feasibility study. What does that mean?
So before you undertake a larger study to see whether the treatment is effective or not, you're always asked to carry out a pilot study or a feasibility study to see whether it's going to work or not, and iron out any particular problems that we can look at in a smaller scale study before we then go on to a bigger study. And in a feasibility study, you've got certain things that you want to look at. One of those is about how easy it is to recruit people. Another aspect is how easy it is to retain those people in the study so that we can follow them through the study. We also want to look at how representative the sample is. We want to look at how acceptable different aspects of the study is to the people taking part. And we also carry out a preliminary evaluation of whether the intervention looks like it's going to be useful if we were to do it in a larger scale. In addition to that, we were also asked to carry out a health economics analysis. So basically that was we were asked to carry out an analysis to see whether there were economic benefits, as well as to the people themselves, but also in terms of the costs. So this is actually valuable within the NHS to see whether people, as well as the treatment being effective, in terms of whether we're offering cost effectiveness in the treatment.
So who was on the research team?
So there were a number of people on the research team. There was myself, who is co-chief investigator, alongside Professor Anthony David, who's a professor that's worked for many, many years with depersonalisation, derealisation disorder. In addition to that, there was a senior psychiatrist, Professor Glyn Lewis at UCL, who's undertaken other similar research trials, so he was very useful to have on the team. We had an independent statistician, Dr. Raphael Gafour, who was able to analyse the results without knowing who was in what group, so being able to do that so that he was able to be independent from the results. We had a qualitative researcher, that's Professor Nicola Morant, who was able to supervise and lead on the qualitative work that I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. And we had a person with lived experience who was part of the research team and able to then advise on all the aspects of the study from a lived experience perspective. And in addition to that, we had several research assistants who their role was to conduct the assessments at different time points through the study. And we also had a health economics professor who was involved in the study, who was able to do that part of the analysis. And my role in the study was to train and supervise the clinicians that were then delivering the intervention, and to oversee the project overall.
Who was eligible to take part and how many people were included?
So we had people that were over the age of 18, but no maximum age, so people up to 75. They had to have current symptoms of depersonalisation and or derealisation that would be severe enough to meet criteria for depersonalisation, derealisation disorder currently. In addition, they might have symptoms of anxiety or depression, but people who had current symptoms of psychosis or PTSD were excluded from the study, and that was because those people would actually benefit from other treatments. And in the end, we were able to recruit the minimum that we needed of 30 people to take part in the study.
And what were the participants offered?
So it depended on what arm they were randomised to. If they were allocated to the CBT-f-DDD condition, they would then be given a clinician to work with them over a 6-month period. This clinician had received the specialist training in CBT for depersonalisation, derealisation disorder, and the clinician would meet myself regularly for supervision to guide them through the treatment process. Alternatively, if the participant was allocated the treatment as usual group, then they would get whatever they would normally get within that service. So that could be CBT, but it could also be other types of support, or it could be medication.
And how was their progress assessed?
So participants in both groups would meet regularly with the research assistant at different set time periods, and each of those meetings they would complete questionnaires and answer questions to monitor their progress, both on the depersonalisation, derealisation, but also on other aspects of other symptoms that they might have. Then at the end of the treatment, they were then asked to complete a satisfaction with the process questionnaire, and that would be answering questions about different aspects of the study and how they found it. And then they would also be asked to take part in an interview, those in the CBT for depersonalisation group, because we wanted a really in-depth analysis of what it was like to receive that treatment. And also clinicians, when they'd finished with the clients that they were seeing, they also took part in a qualitative interview.
What's different about CBT for DDD compared to usual CBT?
So CBT in different conditions, there are different models and different emphases in what you do in the CBT. So the CBT for depersonalization derealization disorder really has the symptoms of depersonalization derealization at the heart of the treatment and the heart of the model that we're working from. So what we will be doing with people is helping them to understand what may have caused their depersonalization derealization disorder and what might be keeping it going. And so we're working with people to help them understand the condition better and then find ways of changing some of those patterns that might be unhelpful in the way they might be thinking about the symptoms and the way they may be reacting to the symptoms. So that's what makes it a little bit different from just more general CBT, which might be looking at other aspects, not particularly focused on the depersonalization derealization.
What were the findings for the recruitment?
Well, we were very pleased to find actually we had a very steady rate of referrals. The main source of those referrals were from talking therapy services. So those are the sorts of services in primary care in the NHS. They sometimes are referred to as IAP services, increasing access to psychological therapy services. So they're usually the sort of front line of CBT services in the NHS. And we were very able to identify clients with depersonalization derealization disorder within those services. But because we only had a small number of NHS trusts that were taking part, it did mean that recruitment was a bit slower than we'd hoped for. So we were getting about 2.5 eligible referrals per month. So a nice steady stream, but quite small amount of people. So what we had to do in the end was actually extend the recruitment period so that we could get more, we could meet our targets. But if we were to do that again in the future, we would obviously have more sites that we would be recruiting from, and that would help resolve that issue.
Did any people drop out, or were they retained for the study?
Well, we found that 54% of people had 6 or more CBT sessions. Now we sort of landed on the 6 sessions as being a sort of minimum dose of therapy that we would expect to have some effectiveness. And that was a lower proportion than we had hoped for, but it was the same as other people receiving CBT for other conditions in the same services. So it was just the same amount of people dropping out as it would be for CBT for other conditions. And the main reasons for those people dropping out were because people moved away from the area. So because we were a London sample, people often move around in London or move to outside of London. And because the way we had set up this study, if people moved outside of London, it meant we couldn't then still offer them that treatment. So they then dropped out. In the future, we will work to redesign the study a bit so that we can actually follow up people even if they relocate.
You mentioned that one of the criteria for a feasibility study is representativeness. Was this sample the same as previous samples?
What we found in this sample was that people were a bit younger than in the previous samples that we'd looked at. Also, the duration of their depersonalization derealization disorder was shorter, and their symptoms were a bit less severe. Now, this is probably just because we were mainly recruiting from this primary care talking therapies. So that's where people are at the sort of start of this help seeking. Whereas in the other samples, they were from a specialist service. So those people had had their symptoms for longer and had other treatments before coming to the specialist service. So that's probably what explains the difference.
Did people find the study acceptable?
So we looked at both groups, both those that had received the CBT for depersonalisation intervention and those that were assigned to the treatment as usual group and combined those answers together. That's the way it's standardly done. And so across the board, some were more acceptable than others, but none of them were deemed unacceptable, any of the factors that we looked at. The things that people liked best were the assessment process, the way queries were dealt with, and they felt that the questionnaires used were very useful. The things that were more moderate ratings was a randomisation process. So sometimes people that were randomised to the treatment as usual obviously didn't find that as acceptable as if they'd got the intervention. But also the satisfaction with therapy and how people felt about their symptoms afterwards were more moderate ratings.
What did people say in their interviews?
Well, the interviews were with the people that had received the CBT for depersonalisation intervention, and nearly all of them reported an improvement in their symptoms and were actually very positive about the intervention itself. And sometimes what they talked about was a change in the relationship to the symptoms. Even though they may still have residual symptoms, they were actually less scared about those symptoms and actually found that the symptoms impacted on their functioning less. So they were able to go about things better than they'd previously been able to do. They did also make some suggestions for things that would be very helpful to us in the future. So one of the things that they talked about was that sometimes the continuity of their sessions was interrupted, and that's because the therapists were working in busy NHS services, were doing this in addition to other things that they were doing. And so in the future what we'd like to do is actually employ the therapist directly onto the trial, so that those therapists have a bit more protected time for the work with the CBT for depersonalisation derealisation disorder. And the other thing that people fed back was that often they were offered either in-person or online sessions, but they could often be seen quicker with online sessions, or that was just more convenient. But their reflections were that they probably would have benefited from more an in-person sessions, because one of the issues with depersonalisation derealisation is that people can feel a little bit disconnected, and they felt that actually maybe doing the sessions in person might have helped to correct that more.
You said that therapists were also interviewed. What did they say about CBT for DDD?
Overall, they were very positive about the intervention, and I think they liked having something that they felt they could offer to people with depersonalisation derealisation disorder. And one of the things that they felt strongly was what we've been saying for a long time, is that that training on depersonalisation derealisation disorder should really form part of the core training for clinicians. And they also felt that pathways should be developed within the NHS so that people presenting with this condition have a series of different treatments that they can go through.
What were the results from the economic evaluation?
Well, the health economics analysis was very positive and quite impressive, actually, in that although the CBT for depersonalisation derealisation disorder was a little bit more expensive than the treatment as usual, as you might expect. It was only a little bit more expensive, but the actual benefits, the societal benefits as they're called, were actually about £150 per person that took part. So what they're doing there is actually looking at increased productivity, fewer consultations and less medications in the group that had the CBT for depersonalisation. So overall, there was actually a benefit to society for those people, an economic benefit as well as the health benefits to the people. But this is an economic benefit that actually it reduces the cost overall within society. So that was a really good finding.
What about the preliminary results in terms of improvements to DDD symptoms?
So those in the CBT for depersonalisation group, nearly double the number said that they felt some benefit from the intervention compared to those in the treatment as usual group. And also their improvement in scores was nearly double those in the treatment as usual group as well. However, because the numbers are very small, we had 30 people overall, and then that's split between two groups, that number is too small really to be able to statistically say we've got a result here. And that's why this is a pilot study that will then need to be followed up with a larger scale study where we get larger numbers of people that take part, and then you can actually get statistical power, it's called, to actually be able to tell whether the intervention is successful. But certainly the results were moving in the right direction. They were going in what we would hope to see. And
finally, what's next?
Well, we think this is a really important first step in looking at providing CBT for depersonalisation disorder within the NHS. We had got these results from specialist studies that allowed us to get the funding for this, but this is really being able to start to see whether we can train up staff within the NHS to actually deal with people from all over the country, not just one specialist clinic in London, which is just going to get too many people being referred and not very convenient for people that are distributed all over the country. So it's a really important first step. But we would want to make some changes going forward. So that's the whole purpose of doing a pilot or a feasibility study, is to iron out what some of those issues might be. So what we would want to do going forward is to include different sites across the UK. So we were only able to get a small number of trusts within London. There were central London and outer London, but we'd obviously want to include other areas across the country and rural areas as well as urban areas as well, to get a more representative sample. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd also want to employ the clinicians onto the study so that they didn't have other demands on their time, and therefore if people also moved, we could then continue to offer them treatment and to get larger numbers in order to be able to look at the effectiveness and compare the two groups. So that would be the next step.